things. I believe this is certainly the only way that things will be dramatically better in 20 years' time. And I think the sort of modality that you have for this is quite different from the modality that's used for globalization, where it's about a consensus of what works. I often, I'll give sort of two anecdotes, one with respect to startups, one with respect to interview questions that I use to try to bring this kind of idea out. So the definitive idea of the future, when you have a company that gets started, they often have a PowerPoint presentation. They will have a slide where they describe what the business is going to do. And you have one type of company where it's, well, we can do many different things. We can do A or B or C or D or E. And you have a company where it's, we are going to do A. The company that says A through E is always worse than the one that just says A, even though mathematically the opposite should be true. Mathematically, you'd say A through E has to be better than just A. But when you have A through E, it means that you've not really thought through any of these things very well, and probably they're all kind of bad, and they have not been thought through well. Whereas if you have a specific idea, it's a plan you can work against, coordinate against, measure yourself against, and try to improve. I used to play chess scholastically in junior high school in the U.S., and sort of one of the intermediate level chess things. You initially learn how to move the pieces and combinations and how to get to checkmate and things like that. But sort of one of the intermediate level things you learn in chess is that it's always good to have some kind of a plan. And even if it's a bad plan, it's something you can measure yourself against versus having no plan at all. So what are you trying to do? And a definite plan is a plan, something where you create options for many different plans is an anti-plan. It's a way, in effect, to avoid thinking about things. The education question that alluded to in the opening comments that we've come to think about is, I'm very much in favor of education. I think it's important. I think learning is important. But I think it's also very important to ask why you're learning, what is it for? And one of the strange paradoxes in the United States and many other countries is that education has become increasingly a status-driven credential where you simply get it in order to get other things. And it is, I think, the purest version of the indefinite future. And we can think of things like going to business school as maybe the most indefinite version of education, where why do you go to business school? In order to become a businessman. What sort of business? Doesn't matter. If you had a specific idea, that would actually be seen as a bad thing, because that would be like you were too narrow, too focused. And so we just create all these people who have these very general backgrounds, and you end up with this paradox where what do you do at the end of your high school years? Don't know. You go to college. What did you do at the end of your college years? You don't know. You go to graduate school. What do you do at the end of your grad school years? You don't know, but you get some sort of job, not a job you want to do for the rest of your life, or that you think is important, but one that will be good for your resume and will help you in some somewhat poorly defined way in the future. I was teaching a class at Stanford this last quarter, and I spent one day meeting with about 30 students, 20 minutes each, giving them career advice. It was in the law school context, but I think this is very representative of the thinking in many of these places. About 2/3 of them planning to work at major law firms, not a single one planning to become a partner, not a single one really excited about it. It was just, this was what you did to build your resume, and then it would sort of be this mechanical process where you did not think about the future, and it would just sort of gradually unfold. And I think this is the question about education that's gone wrong, is that it's become paradoxically a way to avoid thinking about your future. You learn certain broadly applicable things, and then you just adjust as things go on. And so I think this idea of having too many plans, too many options, has often become a way to avoid thinking very carefully about a specific plan or a specific option, or what you will do with that. One way I often frame this as an interview question, and I think when you interview people, there's always a question how important interviews are in general, because maybe they're just select for people who are good at interviewing and don't select for anybody else. One of the other kinds of problems one has with interview questions is eventually people learn the questions and they learn the right answers. So, for example, Google used to always have these sort of math puzzle questions as interviews, and they I think were very good, and they actually help identify some very talented people early on. At this point, there are something like 6,000, 7,000 people they're trying to hire every year at Google. You can get the answers to all the questions on the internet, and so the math puzzle questions don't quite work anymore. And so you'd imagine there being two types of interview questions. One type of question is one where, and almost all of them are like this, where you haven't heard the question before, and it sort of is a pretty good test, but the test only works if you don't know the questions in advance. A really good question is one where it's still an equally good question, even if you know the question in advance. My candidate for such a question, and it's one I will maybe end this talk with, is what do you believe that is true that very few or nobody agrees with you on? Because I believe the answer to that can be the starting point for the kind of technological breakthrough or meaningful work or meaningful life that is going to leave the world in a much better place and help us go from 0 to 1 in the developed world. What do you know that is true that almost nobody agrees with you? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter Thiel. You noticed that he studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and thank you for this wonderful synthesis of entrepreneurship and philosophy. Questions for Peter Thiel? Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that very spiritual and enthusiastic discussion about education. I happen to share the time in the Bay Area from 1988, 1992 with you, so I'm quite excited to see that there is activity going on at the Bay Area, also with respect to financing. I think that's one of the topics that we're all interested in here. Bay Area used to be the starting point for a lot of new technologies. There was a lot of venture capital companies. There still are in San Francisco and the surroundings. But in the last 3 to 4 years, we have seen lots of these technologies actually going back to Europe, because there is a better funding for startup companies. What do you see is happening in the Bay Area at the moment? Is the environment changing? Is it getting better? Is startup actually an alternative again, or is it only something for companies that actually have something in place already?
Well, I think Silicon Valley is doing about as well as any place in the U.S. is at this point. I don't necessarily have a perspective where I can give a great perspective on how it compares with all other centers of technology innovation in the world, but I think within the U.S. it's clearly the leader, and perhaps by a bigger margin than it ever has been. And so there's sort of a degree to which things have, if anything, become more concentrated around Silicon Valley. I think there's been I don't think we're anywhere near the insanity of the 1990s, but we are definitely feels that it is in a reasonably ebullient and optimistic mood, and is an extremely sharp contrast from much of the rest of the U.S. or even the rest of the state of California.
Next question. Lisa.
So Peter, can you talk about the role that philanthropy can play? And the reason that I bring that up is I work with Paul Romer, and we're playing this whole charter cities thing.
Yes, in Honduras or wherever.
Yeah, and clearly I feel like philanthropy can play a very unique role. We don't have stakeholders, we don't have to listen to, we can do that, here's our vision, and we don't really care what anybody else thinks. But there isn't philanthropy hardly anywhere that is taking advantage of those kinds of things. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Let's see. Well, I think I think there are. I think one of the things that is one of the biases I have on a lot of the philanthropy questions is that there is probably a lot to be said for sort of business and philanthropy, and that it's not always the right decision to blend the two. So I am personally a little bit skeptical of social entrepreneurship as a model. Again, I think there are cases where it works, but unfortunately there are many cases where people try to do well by doing good and end up doing neither, where it's like and you have, I think, almost like these two different Platonic forms, for profit, not for profit, and you should keep them somewhat separate. And there are all sorts of non-profit things that are, and philanthropic, that are not profitable, and they can't be turned into low-profit things. So it's like, poor people in Africa, very hard to turn into a profit center in any obvious way. There are all sorts of longer-term philanthropic things that I think are very hard to turn into a for-profit area. So I actually, the way I think about it is two very separate categories. So I do think philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, are quite important. Where I see the biggest gap, and I think some of the work Romer's doing is actually very good and fairly unusual as well, is that a tremendous amount of the nonprofit, if you sort of, again, think of my two axes, the x-axis is globalization, the y-axis is technology. There certainly is a degree to which our bias has been very much on the globalization side and not as much on the technology side in the US and Western Europe for many decades. But I think in philanthropy, this sort of skew towards globalization is even more accentuated. And almost all philanthropy, as far as I can tell, involves some idea of going from one to n. It is we take things that work and we sort of make them work equally well in other countries. Whereas the idea of intensive philanthropy, of taking the things that are the best in the world and trying to make them better, is seen as very politically incorrect. It's why do you need to improve the things that are best? Even though I think in any healthy world, you want to have both intensive and extensive growth, because eventually you run out of extensive things, and then you have to again try to do something vertical. And so the areas of philanthropy that I've been exploring a lot in are what are some of the vertical intensive technologies that can't really be done on a for-profit basis and are not being done at all. And we've zeroed in on a whole number of them, but probably the one area that I find just shockingly underfunded are things around aging, preventing aging, and enabling people to live longer. And it is it seems like this would be universally beneficial, and I can go through a whole long, detailed sociological analysis on why so little is done. But a shocking fact is almost all diseases you have are linked to aging. So you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of having cancer when you're 30 years old, a 1 in 10 chance when you're 80. And this is true of many other diseases. If you're 85 years old, you have close to 50% chance of having Alzheimer's. And so it would seem like maybe we should cure the specific diseases, but maybe we should also study the whole aging phenomenon in general as something that might help us understand all these things a lot more. And I think it's been very very underrated for a lot of reasons. One of them is this skew away from intensive growth and intensive development. And that's something I've been looking to work on.
I have a question. I was struck, Peter, that you gave such a persuasive speech in favor of radical innovation being based in San Francisco. And of course, everything you complained about, being obsessed with 1 to n, is true a fortiori in Germany. Our innovation system is based on mature industries that are based on getting a little better every year. Any advice, as someone born in Germany, looking to Germany from San Francisco, how do we change the culture? How do we get people to, at least some of the time, at least some of the people, focus on getting from 0 to 1?
Well, it's always very hard to, any question that starts with how do you change the culture is probably a dangerous question one shouldn't even try to answer, even if you're living in a place continuously. What I do suspect is the case, though, is that there is sort of a cultural dimension to this, and I think this is true even in the United States, where there's a very big difference, say, between California and New York. And New York is much more about people doing professional tracked kinds of careers. And I think the cultural question is whether or not it is respectable to be trying to do something innovative. So if you say that you're an entrepreneur and you go to a dinner party somewhere in Germany, would people assume that you're just a lazy person